Hey, I'm working on a fantasy forest music pack, and one of the tracks I made turned out really well. I wanted to share that and then talk about how I made it. But yeah, let's take a listen. So how did I do that? Of course, I started with just one instrument, and the first thing I started with was the harp. The very first thing I wanted to achieve was I wanted to set the mood with the harp to show you that it's kind of happy and peaceful. And the way I did that was I made some arpeggios in the C major scale. So we have this C, E, G, C. And just with that, you kind of hear some potential. And I wanted to go with a pattern of sort of going down on these first notes. And then you go down again here, come back up, and then back to C. And what I think that achieves is it gives you the sense that you're meandering a little bit throughout the forest. Like you're going deeper and deeper into it, but it's not sucking you in. After I made the harp part, the next thing I did was make a strings part. And what I wanted to achieve here was, so you have the harp part which represents you walking through the forest, and then the strings part is kind of nature happening to you. So it might be the trees swaying in the breeze, it might be birds flying, past your head, on your left, on your right. And the way I embody that was sort of following the C major chords, but you can see I sort of ease into it and then very quickly fade back out. So those two elements really work together, and I think an important thing to note is that I actually have the string section mixed way down here, so it's much quieter than the harp. And I think a common mistake I see is people really like the sound of their chords and they feel like the listener just has to hear them, but in reality, the only thing the chords need to do is kind of give you that subtle idea in the back of your head of where the song wants to go. Now, even if we have everything, right? The bass and the percussion. You see, it becomes more and more subtle, but also it's essential, because here's what it sounds like without it. And I think it's more somber and reflective, but it doesn't have the life that a forest adds. I think a part without the string section early on could also be a good way to have an intro, but I wanted a sense of immediate motion, and I didn't want anything to be too abrupt in the loop or changes further on, so that's why I started off including the string section. So then I'm still building this first pattern, because the first pattern is kind of what decides the pace of everything else. The first pattern gives you your chords, your progressions, your rhythms. It gives you everything that you're going to want to subvert later and change later. So to round out the first pattern, I of course added some very simple bass notes just to give you some warmth and a sense of safety. And also I chose some limited percussion. I have two percussive instruments, that being the shaker and the bongos. And you can see I've made the shaker sort of crescendo and decrescendo. And it's much quieter in the intro than it gets later on. So let's hear it with the harp, the strings, and the shakers. You see, it's very, very subtle in the background, the shakers are. And also the bongos. The bongos are another rhythmic factor that give you that sense that you're walking through the forest. You're not just sitting in one place. And see, with just those elements, you can really tell a story. Like, if you move the bongos out, then it feels like you're sitting in the forest. If you have the bongos in, and maybe the strings and shakers out, it sounds like you're walking through the forest alone. So if you wanted to, you could take some very simple elements like this, change it up, and all of a sudden you have a full minute-plus track that loops and tells a story. But that's not quite the story I wanted to tell. I wanted to get a little bit more interesting with it. I wanted the forest to really open up and show you its wonder. And that is why I added the melody with the violin. So let's hear the part where the violin comes in, and you see over here, it crescendos a lot, so it starts very quietly, and then it gets louder. And let's really pay attention to that effect. And that way it really sounds like a welcome visitor. It's not something that sneaks up on you in the brush. It's something, maybe a bird in their nest. You're walking along and you see life everywhere you look. But it's not life that's trying to eat you or get in your way. It's just something to make the view prettier and really make you remember that you're just one small part in this grand ecosystem. So that's these first two patterns. How did I decide what to add after that? Now, instead of going with just these two patterns into the B section, which we'll talk about later, which actually goes more into A minor, the reason I have another melody section is that for some reason, when I was listening to this, I actually had it that way, where I would go from the second pattern straight into the B section, but for some reason, it just felt too early and abrupt, and I can't explain why, it just did, because I didn't hear this for long enough. And I think when that happens, you really have to listen to your instinct. It could be when you've made something that needs to be repeated more, or it could also be when you've repeated something too much. You really have to pay attention to what your gut is telling you, and my gut told me to add another section. So how did I change things up to keep it from becoming stale? Simple. I added a piano, sort of highlighting notes above the melody. So let's pay attention to that. Thanks to that repetition of the violin phrase with added context from the piano, it's sort of matured enough that you're ready to let it go and go into something new. And my interpretation of what the piano is doing here is that I think the piano is sort of like your brain when you're on the walk. You know, you see all this nature, the violin, the birds in the trees in their nest feeding their young, but your brain remembers very specific things, you know? Maybe that bird in the tree reminds you of how your parents treated you when you were little, right? So it's just, the piano is kind of reflecting the motion of your own brain in response to the outside stimulus. And that's just one way to visualize it. You can visualize it however you want. The important thing is that when you make music, the more you find meaning in your own music, the more you're going to be able to impart on the listener through the sounds that you select. And now, going back to the sounds itself and the basic principles, notice how the piano was quite subtle, right? It wasn't stealing the show, just the fact that it existed there and had that high register that none of the other instruments are really occupying made you notice it. And it set this pattern apart from the prior one, giving it a sense of evolution. And, you know, like I said, it matures it, it prepares you for this B section, which, in my opinion, is the favorite part of the song. It's the part that you look forward to every time it loops, the part that kind of ties it all together. So, what decision did I make, right? How did I extend it from these three sections that are relatively similar, just building up on each other, to this other half that's different? The first decision I made is to try and solidify this more in A minor. And I think switching from a more major vibe to a more minor vibe, it gives you that sense of self-reflection. And let's hear that transition. Right. So it's not really going in one direction. Over here, you're building up to here. Over here, you were building up to here. But over here, you're kind of losing energy, shifting focus. And if you're paying attention, like really close attention, you'll notice that the harp arpeggio is actually not in this second melody section. In fact, the harp barely has a part over here, and that's to create space. What you may have noticed is that a lot of the instruments that were here, the violin, the piano, they're not in this B section. But now that we have more context about what the harp was doing, we also notice it goes from a section with very little harp to a section where the harp is the focus again. And now that we're back to a little bit of stuff, we can build up to more stuff. And because this happens over a lesser period of time, it's going to be more dramatic, more emotional, and more impactful. So over here, what I really tried to do is just, I knew I had a job, so I wanted to do it right. So how do we build up? Build up fast, build up strong, so that it doesn't sound weird, so that it doesn't feel like I have to go longer. So what I did is, instead of copying the format over here, where I had 8 bars of harp doing its thing, and then the violin comes in, I had only 4 bars of harp, and then the violin comes in, so it's faster. And that way, when we end off here, this part is actually a continuation of the violin melody. So let's take a listen to that again. And the piano is introduced again. It's teaming up with the violin. And this is a restatement of the melody from the previous pattern. And then it goes back to C major. So it's all about the energy. Just visually, you can even tell where the energy is heading. You see, it's lowest here. It starts to ramp up a little bit with the introduction of the violin, and then here it's really hitting it. The piano comes in like a little bit of a surprise this time, and it's just shadowing a new violin melody. And I think it's kind of a culmination of all the emotions that you might feel when listening to everything else. So it's kind of a resolution for the rest of the song. It makes the build-up worth it. It's not just background noise, it's, something heartfelt. Walking through this forest is stirring things within you, and I think that's important to a game soundtrack. And then, of course, this part at the end, some of the energy has dissipated. It's kind of like, it's giving you space to contemplate your own emotions. It's not forcing it on you, and that way, when we make the return, it's really seamless. Or is it seamless? Seamless or seamless? It's really seamless. But yeah, that's my forest path theme. I felt really happy with it, and so that's why I wanted to share it and talk about it a little bit. But yeah, if you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe for more stuff like this, and thanks for watching this whole thing.